Howdy, y'all. It's me, Dr. Edwards. Welcome back. I'm here to help you with Module 7 this week. What constitutes a cultural norm? So, let's start off with defining what a cultural norm is. Just put it simply, a cultural norm is anything that a particular group decides is normal, all right? And so we got to keep a relativistic perspective here that there is no universal standard, that one norm is not going to be the same for all different societies. Actually, on that note, we do see that there are some universal things across people, such as, all peoples are organized, have some political organization. That doesn't mean that politics, if you would, but they're organized in some fashion. All groups have some idea of kinship. There's a pretty universal idea of marriage, even though it may not be defined as we define it, but a social relationship between individuals. So there are lots of kind of universal things that we see across people, but when it comes to cultural norms, these are always going to be unique and different. All right. And so, what does this have to do with our other material this week? Well, because any group is going to have their own, their own standards of what is right and what is wrong. That's the cultural norm part. Culturally accepted practices, behaviors, and what's considered inappropriate. And what I like to suggest is to think about it as a spectrum for any group, right? And in the middle, you're going to have the normative behavior, okay? What is generally accepted, right? And on either end, you're going to have outliers, right? Both positive or negative. So this helps give a more kind of nuanced understanding of cultural norms. Looking at my notes here, I have some things I want to discuss. Give you a personal example of some cultural norms. In Mali, I work with a lot of traditional hunters, and hunting is part of a way of life there. It's a life way for some groups, not all groups. Right? I work predominantly with the Malinke and the Bamana. And both of these groups where I work, they are very protective of their wildlife resources, all their natural resources. They do not like outsiders coming in because their cultural norm is that those resources are for them. They don't belong to other people, and they take extreme action against outsiders that come in and violate that. This leads to violence. I've heard some pretty atrocious stories of, well, atrocious, that's my cultural judgment, but based on local values, local norms, it was completely acceptable. There was actually a group of Mauritanians, just north of Mali, that came down into the area where I was working, and they came down to hunt, and the local groups, local Malinke did not like this, and they went out and executed them. They ambushed them, and that is a kind of an extreme example of a cultural norm, right? From the Malinke perspective, that was completely okay. From my Western perspective, my Western cultural norms, that's an extremely aggressive and violent act, that we might consider is more appropriately dealt with through discussion and engagement and not violence. So it's kind of an extreme case, but it gets the idea across. I also shared previously in the term a story about my experience in northern Pakistan, where I saw a case of death enmity. Essentially, they have culturally sanctioned murder. You are allowed to seek revenge if certain things are done to you. Again, that's a unique cultural norm. And what's kind of interesting about these two that I described is that there's a violent aspect to it. That really gets at some of our reading this week. All right, where does this violence come from? Is it universal to all peoples? Is it in our DNA? Is it genetic? Um, and we actually you're introduced to a unique theoretical perspective here called sociobiology. And a good way to think of that is an evolutionary perspective on behavior. And so your readings this week, they highlight are humans inherently violent? And you get two perspectives, yes and no. On the yes side, you have Richard Wrangham, who explains how chimps, one of our closest living relatives, evolutionarily speaking, and how they are extremely male dominated. They are very violent, and he puts forth the argument that due to male chimps or male chimps that fight reproduce more than chimps that do not. Okay, and so that therefore passes on some aggressive, violent gene. Yeah. Now it's really interesting because while that particular case may lend some support to evolutionary roots in behavior, it's not a complete story. This is interesting because I actually teach a lot of sociobiology. I teach a course on the evolution of human sexuality. And in that course, we actually go through all the various primates and look at their mating systems and why they do what they do. And an important thing to keep in mind is it's usually closely associated or correlated with environmental resources. Food! No food, no reproduction. Okay? So this actually brings up, I highlight it in the written portion of my announcement, there's another species of great ape called a bonobo. Now, over the past, they used to think that they were just a subspecies of chimpanzees. But they're not. They're actually a completely, entirely separate species, right? They're actually one of the 5 great apes. You have chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, and us. So this other species, bonobos, wow, they are like night and day compared to chimpanzees, and they live fairly close by, same general region, Central Africa. And bonobos, they settle disputes with sex. All sorts of sex. The freakiest sex you've ever heard of. I'm being kind of silly, but it puts the Kama Sutra to shame. It doesn't. You can have intergenerational sex. You can have homosexual sex. There's female, male, male, grandmother, grandson. You name it, it's happening. And this really kind of sets up this kind of duality. Chimps being, giving insight into possibly why we might have certain aggressive tendencies, right, in certain circumstances. I'm going to add that. And the other side of humanity, the peace side, all right? So we got war and peace. It really kind of sets up this duality. And because chimpanzees and bonobos are our closest living relatives, it gives some insights into possible insights. There has not been a specific gene found that cross-correlates between chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans that is clearly the violence gene. Now, interestingly, within humans, there has been some genes that have been found in association with particular behaviors. I'm not going to go down that road right now because I'm trying to focus on the evolutionary perspective from chimpanzees and bonobos to humans. This duality really kind of reflects some more deep understanding of, is it culture? Is it biology? Is it environment? Is it a combination of all of them? That's kind of where I fall. biology influences culture, environment influences biology. So these things, it's hard to say that it is particularly one of those three: biology, environment, or culture. It tends to be much more of a dynamic relationship between all three of those key factors that may explain why we see certain behaviors. Yeah. Let's see here. Looking at my notes, other things I wanted to touch on. Yeah, on some of our learning objectives this week, illustrate the complexity of various forms of rationalized violence. Well, you can flip back to Module 2, where we talked about the Yanomami, and Napoleon Chagnon was our focus and his ethical issues. But the case study of the Yanomamo is really appropriate. Chagnon presents them as being inherently violent. Now, we've learned that that was his unique perspective, to say the least, that he may have actually, used his data to support a particular perspective and ignored others. All right. We also looked at the case of the colonization of the Congo Basin and Belgium, the colonizers. This is a good example for, looking at how institutions remember social violence and atrocities. You were actually given a link to a site that kind of compared a local perspective from the Belgian perspective on that. And while that might not be defined as a war, there were clear atrocities. Some estimates over 1 million people were exterminated. Let's see here. Identify examples of how violence and war can shape social issues that represent the past. We had a great example about the Enola Gay at the Smithsonian, and how that very limited perspective of what was shared, what was put on display, it was not a full perspective. It only gave certain insights. So that actually does a really nice job of showing how some historical event, right, can shape social thought, right, social issues. They willfully, the Smithsonian, kept certain parts of the story out of the display, right? We see that veterans had particular perspectives about it. And that would be different than, say, the Japanese perspective on it. And it would really only be by taking all of those that we would get more of a pluralistic perspective of kind of seeing the relative positions and values, norms, of these different groups involved. So yeah, that actually gets into this last aspect. Conclude how different cultural groups can own the same wartime history. Well, depending on what side of the war you were on, or the event, you'll have certain perspectives about it. And again, think about it, the spectrum, right? It's not all just going to be one-sided. You're going to have kind of a middle ground where most people kind of identify with, and then extremes on either end. We this past week we looked at genocide, and this is a great example because those groups that are involved in various genocidal activities will have very specific perspectives on their role, their involvement, their rights about what they did or what happened to them. What's really interesting is you look at these, and they often the conflict can be traced back to colonization. In Rwanda, the Hutus and Tutsis were actually they used to, prior to colonization, work cooperatively. They lived cooperatively. There was intermarriage, yada yada. But when the colonizers came, they actually further separated them. In fact, they instituted ethnic identity cards that you are X and you are Y. Then, when colonization ended and the rise of independence in Africa in the early 1960s, the colonizers pulled out and they essentially put one group in a position of power. Now, you can see how that historical process might create some issues, all right? So yeah, it's a good example. Same in Mali, it was colonized by the French. To this day, there are some strong feelings. Various groups have particular perspectives. When I'm there, because I speak, if people hear me speaking French, they tend to assume that I'm French, and there's a lot of animosity that gets put put toward me. When folks realize or come to learn that I'm not French, I just speak it. Those positions change drastically. They're like, oh, you're not French? Oh, okay, we don't hate you so much. Yeah, don't mean to be flippant, but hopefully that kind of gives you some insights. Now, I'm going to put together a separate video for your Module 7, well, not Module 7, for your final project Part 2. So look for that, right? I'm going to try to give you some clear orientation to help you execute that assignment. So that's where I'll leave this. Be sure to check out all the extra resources I provide. Yeah, and have a good one. Take care. Bye.